Star Wars only, I don't know what the fuck your problem is.
What's going on, Star Wars fans? I am Star Wars Only, and today I want to talk about this article that came out from Screen Rant called Every Star Wars Movie Ranked by Rotten Tomatoes Score. I think this is an interesting topic. Rotten Tomatoes has become a controversial subject over the past, 2-3 years? It's been fun to watch that. But let's just talk about the scores that they give the Star Wars movies and where the rankings are. Number 10, which is the worst, it's going from 10, the worst, number 1 is the best. Number 10 is Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and that is at a 54% on Rotten Tomatoes. If you've seen my documentary, The Phantom Menace 20 Years Later, you know a lot about this film and the reaction fans had to it, why they had this reaction to it, and all that. So I don't have to go over everything too much, but a short summary of why people were disappointed with this film were the expectations. Sky high, 16-year hiatus for Star Wars, coming back, you have to deliver with this perfect story, this perfect film. And this film definitely fell far from the tree. It was not even close to perfect. I don't think it was close to great. I think it's a film that visually is amazing, stunning in terms of visual effects of what it did at the time, the revolutionary technology it brought forward with digital effects and CGI characters that we have nowadays, like Gollum and Davy Jones and all that stuff. All that came from Jar Jar. It pushed the envelope in a lot of areas like that. And this film has a great score to it, one of the best scores in the franchise. John Williams did an amazing job on this film. I think I'm kind of missing that in the sequels. I wish he would get a lot of the magic that he had in the prequels back again, because I feel like that's missing in a way with the new movies. But anyways, this score is amazing. The action at the end of it is really good with Maul and Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. I just don't feel a connection to a lot of the characters. The acting isn't great, the writing, the pacing, there's a lot of problems with this film, and I don't think it really fits as well in the Star Wars franchise as it could. I think the Clone Wars has really helped bring the characters from the show, and the books that have come out recently as well have really helped enhance the story that we have with the Phantom Menace. But on its own as a film, without the Clone Wars, without the books, without the comic books, I don't think it's a great film, and I don't think it does a lot of justice to the Star Wars franchise compared to the original trilogy. At the time in 1999, I can understand, and I still to this day understand why people are disappointed with this film and are not fond of this film. I don't love it to death. I don't hate it. I don't dislike it either. I watch it maybe once a year just to kind of refresh myself on it. There are moments I enjoy. The pod racing scene is great. It does look great even now. But sadly, Episode 1 is not a movie I'm a fan of, even to this day, 20 years later.
That's great.
It's going to be great.
That's going to be great.
It's going to be great.
That's going to be great.
But on to number 9 on the Rotten Tomatoes list, we have Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. I would switch this personally with The Phantom Menace. This has a rating of 65% on Rotten Tomatoes, and The Phantom Menace has 54%. I would switch the rating. I would switch the placement. I think The Phantom Menace is a better film than Attack of the Clones. Attack of the Clones is probably my, if not one of my least favorite Star Wars movies. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. If you look at the polls that people do, this isn't a fan favorite. This isn't a popular Star Wars film. The romance is, for a lot of people. I think for me, personally, and a lot of other people, now, the expanded universe, like the Clone Wars and the video games that spawned off from this movie, are what really make this movie better. The stuff that goes on outside of it, the outside stories, the little Easter eggs. That's what kind of makes this movie better. For the memes nowadays, people like the memes and this stuff, but overall, Attack of the Clones is not a movie I enjoy. I understand back in 2002 when this was released, I remember seeing this in theaters. A lot of people weren't loving it. It was coming off 1999's The Phantom Menace. That was already kind of a step down for a lot of people, and this just kind of drove it a little deeper, a little worse. This film did not do well in 2002. It was the first Star Wars movie to never be the number 1 of the year. I think it lost to Spider-Man 2 that year. Was it Spider-Man 2 or was it Spider-Man 3? I'm pretty confident it was Spider-Man 2, but it lost to Spider-Man that year. The Tobey Maguire one, the OG, my boy. But it lost to that movie that year because there wasn't a lot of hype for it compared to Episode 1. You had a really disappointing film with Episode 1. Coming right after that, going into 2002 Attack of the Clones, it was a hard thing to ask Star Wars fans to get as hyped and get back into this movie. And then when you have such an overabundance of politics and love and just really cringy dialogue and things that people wouldn't say, and you have George Lucas writing it. I mean, that's as simple as it is. The big problem with this movie, yet again, is George Lucas. And I hate saying that because I love the man to death. I'm one of the biggest George Lucas fans you are going to find out there, but he is one of the big problems with this movie, and his creative control over it really hindered it. And what's crazy is he predicted that this was going to be a film that people didn't like. After episode 1, he said, people aren't going to like episode 2 because of the love story. And he was right. It's sad that he was right. There's not a lot of pros I can give this movie, honestly. It's one of those that I'm really not a big fan of. So the next one is number 8, Solo, a Star Wars story. This is surprising to me. It's at a 70% on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I personally don't see why this got 70%. I think it deserves a little less, maybe in the 60 area. Whatever, maybe the critics are really big fans of Solo for some reason. I think this movie had the perfect storm going into it. You had a bad production, you had a really bad marketing schedule and marketing strategy. They really didn't market this movie at all. Alan Ehrenreich had acting coaching going on behind the scenes. I mean, there was just a lot of problems for this movie. And that perfect storm happened. It flopped in the box office. There was a boycott because of The Last Jedi as well. It was not a good time to release this movie. It's also a movie nobody wanted. I mean, really, nobody really wanted this film. No one wanted more of Han Solo. We had enough of him from the original trilogy. You brought him back in the sequels, episode 7. He died off. Okay, we're done with him. This is an unnecessary movie in the Star Wars franchise. You can take it out and the story doesn't change at all. And you can put it in, the story also won't change at all. But does that make it a bad film? No. I mean, as a film, it's really not that bad. It's an average, generic heist movie. Take out the Star Wars name, that's all it is. I think that's why it's at 70%. Because it executes that just good enough to pass, where you can watch it and have an enjoyable time and say, hey, you know what? That wasn't bad. I got my money's worth. There's some parts I liked and enjoyed. There were some really cool scenes. Overall, and it's not a bad film, so it's definitely passable. It's definitely a film that I think you can look at and say, hey, that's a good film. 70%. I disagree personally with the 70%, but I think that's a fair assessment by the critics. I think that's a fair score, because as a film, Solo is not bad, but I think as a Star Wars film, it doesn't meet the mark. At number 7, we have Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. This is at 80%, which is 10% above Solo, a Star Wars story, a whole letter grade above it. So it's a pretty big jump in critic score compared to the other Star Wars films, which I think is accurate. I remember when this film came out. I remember seeing it a lot when it came out as a kid, and the hype around it. This was the final installment to the Star Wars saga that we knew of back in 2005. And after the disappointment that we had with the other prequel movies, this one was the one that, finally did it right. I mean, even after the film, there were some people who were kind of like, hey, it still wasn't good. It still wasn't good. But a lot of people, most people, I would say, came out saying, hey, that was a lot better than what I thought it was going to be compared to the last two. For a lot of people, this is what the prequel trilogy should have looked like the entire time. And I think there's a good reason for that. The emotion in this is a little more than what we got from the other two installments. The epicness, the grand scale of everything, the feeling like this actually had an impact on the galaxy and was connecting with the original trilogy. It actually felt connected to Star Wars. It actually, to me, felt more like a Star Wars movie. And I think 80% is a really good score for it. I mean, it is a solid B, 80% kind of movie. I don't think it's the best in the world in terms of Star Wars movies. I think it's up there in the top 5 for sure, but not number 1. But definitely top 5 Star Wars movie, and being at 80% makes sense to me. And from what I've seen with the Rotten Tomatoes scores, is that it's been going up as time has gone on. The perception of this movie has really gone up in the past 15 years, and it wasn't even that low when it came out. It was just kind of one of those movies where people were like, hey, a lot of fans of Star Wars liked it. Casual audiences, maybe not so much, but more or less we all really do enjoy Revenge of the Sith nowadays. Looking back in hindsight, it is a well-made Star Wars film. So being at number 7, it's like, damn, that's a little low. But looking at the films that come next, I mean, it's Star Wars. What do you expect? But going to number 6, we actually have Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, and it is at 81%. And I think this is a great film. The problem is, it is the worst film out of a great trilogy, almost a damn near perfect trilogy. This film really started to show the dark side of Star Wars and the franchise aspects of it and the business side of Star Wars. And that is the Ewoks, the toy-heavy stuff that was included in this movie. It kind of got out of hand. It became profit-driven instead of story-driven. And that was something that the critics and audiences knew when they were watching the film. They knew that there was a change in tone. It was lighter-hearted. It was geared a little more towards kids. than the last two installments. And so I think when you have such a great franchise like Star Wars, it is hard to compete with some of these films. I mean, no matter how great of a film you're making, you still have to compete with the other great ones that you have, mainly when you're dealing with the original trilogy like this one is. So I'm sad that it's this low on the list. I do think it's better than some of the other films that are ahead of it, and I think it's a little disappointing that it's this low. I disagree with the score on this. I think it should be at least an 87%, maybe even a little more. I could even argue 90%, but I think that's being a little biased and generous. But I think an 87% would be a good score for this, but it's definitely fresh by Rotten Tomatoes, so that's nice. At number 5, we have the first standalone Star Wars movie, and that is Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. It is at 84%, and I think this movie did a lot of things right. I think it did more right than it did wrong, but those few mistakes that this film made hindered it from being a great Star Wars movie, hindered it from being one of the best, if not the best, Star Wars movies. This was a good movie, and it was an enjoyable movie as a Star Wars fan. However, I feel like as a film, and as a Star Wars movie and Star Wars story, it's funny how it has Star Wars story, I think this film is actually lacking in story and lacking in characters. Honestly, the fan service in this was a lot more than the Solo one. I mean, they really went all out with fan service in this film. And as a fan, I like that. As a fan, I really did enjoy that, but I don't think that makes it a good film. And so 84% seems fair to me. I really think the first two acts dragged on, and I know a lot of critics would agree with me as well. That third act, though, really brought in the film and really seemed a lot more focused. And it really showed that you can make a spin-off film that can do the Star Wars franchise justice and make a good story. I mean, you had all the right elements except the story and except the characters, and that's the sad part about this film. If you would have just had those two parts fixed, I think this would have been a far better film. It had a little bit of production problems and reshooting close to the end of it, and I think that kind of messed with it a little bit, but not too much. It arguably made it better, apparently. But overall, this film is a good one. It's number 5 in one of the best franchises of all time, Star Wars. And I think number 5 is a good ranking for Rogue One. Even though some of the films ahead of it, I would argue, are a little worse, I think this is a good ranking for Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. And at number 4, oh boy, we got Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, at 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. This is where things went crazy with how reviews were done and scores. I don't know. It's one of those confusing things where some people say that, critics are paid off by Disney to give it these positive reviews, and other people, really disagree with that. But with the film that's this divisive in the fan base, the fact that it got 91% I think is baffling to me, because even as a film, I mean, I'm no scholar in terms of films, but even looking at it as a film, there are some flaws to this. I don't think it should be ranked this high personally. I'm surprised critics gave it such a high score, but it did have a lot of positive things, like the ending credits, like the visuals, like the scene with Luke and R2-D2 on the Millennium Falcon. Kylo Ren was a far more interesting character in this one than he was in Episode 7, in my opinion. But this film is a hard thing to talk about and a hard thing to watch, in my opinion. I have never left a theater more disappointed in my life than I have with this film. I mean, if you've watched the channel, man, look at the videos I put out before this film. I even put out a video saying why I'm not excited for this film. It all felt wrong. And watching it, it's just surprising that 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. That's an A. That's not a lot of faults with this movie. There's not a lot of flaws with it. As a film, I can give you a few. Editing. There's some editing mistakes that I noticed the first time I watched this film. And then the pacing. Good God, Canto Bite. That's like 30 unneeded minutes. So the pacing was pretty not great. The writing itself, I mean, honestly, it's surprising that they delayed this film for 8 months to work on the script. What was worked on? What was fixed? What was changed? I mean, how awful could that first draft have been? Is this not the first draft, Ryan? I really don't think this film deserves a 91%. And it's one of those films that's sadly going to be a continuous debate in the fandom. And that 91% number is controversial because it's like, how can a film that divided a fan base this badly and continuously has negative impacts on the fandom and the franchise? I mean, this film really has had a negative impact on the franchise over the last few years. How can this film do so much damage but get a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. Who's wrong here? Is it the fans that don't like the film, or is it the critics that are praising it? Are the critics being paid off by Disney? That's definitely not a far-fetched question right there. That's one that I think is more along the lines than anything. I think the hype and the build-up behind these films are so massive that it's almost hard for it not to get overwhelmingly great ratings, even if it's not that great of a film. And you're going to see it on this next one. At number 3, Star Wars The Force Awakens. It is at 92%, 1% above The Last Jedi. And I do think this is an A movie. I think The Force Awakens did its job as a Star Wars movie on bringing back the feeling of Star Wars. This movie was actually, shot with film. It wasn't digital like George was doing with the prequels in the early 2000s. So that already gave it that more natural Star Wars feel. This felt like you were actually going to the galaxy far, far away again. And the characters were more or less interesting in this film. It did its job of making me excited to see where the story was going. I can't lie to you and say at the end of episode 7 I wasn't extremely hyped to see what was going to happen next with Luke Skywalker. And I really wanted to know all the answers to the questions that they were asking in this film. Who the hell is Snoke? Who are Rey's parents, and what's going to happen with Luke? Why did Luke go away? I was so excited to see what was going on next. My biggest problem with this film, still, and like many other people, is that it's exactly a copy of A New Hope. And as Screen Rant put in this article, it is a shameless rehash of A New Hope. And they're right, it really does steal a lot from A New Hope to the point where it gets annoying. And the mistakes that they make in this film do get on my nerves as well. Some of the ones like JJ's admitted to is Chewbacca walking by Leia and not even a hug or anything like that. Han Solo dying, I think his death was a little anticlimactic. I mean, there are some problems that I have with this film. And sadly for The Force Awakens, I think as time goes on, those problems with this film are going to become more apparent. And the big problems that you're going to have with this film is, why did it go the direction it did? Why did it set up the sequels to go into this direction that really feels like it's just rehashing what happened in the original trilogy? It's going to be one of those weird situations where if Episode 9 does not capitalize on The Force Awakens and, use the stories that tried to build up on, and the characters, and the direction that it went in, and, take that and make something good with Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. If Episode 9 doesn't do great, and doesn't do well, and doesn't execute properly, then maybe The Force Awakens will not age well. And maybe as time goes on, the flaws in the film are going to become more and more apparent. And if Episode 9 is not great, we're really going to look back on Episode 7 and say, well, hey, why didn't you do something different? I mean, you got rid of Luke within the first line of the opening crawl, and you brought back the First Order, which is exactly like the Empire, and Resistance is basically the Rebels again. JJ, why didn't you take this into a new direction? And you could have taken the story in a different direction, and then maybe Rian Johnson could have worked on new characters that isn't Luke Skywalker and really made a really good movie and a good story. Could have had that if The Force Awakens went a different direction. But maybe Episode 9 proves me wrong, or proves that theory wrong in that narrative. So I don't know, but I think at 92%, that's about right. That's in the ballpark of accurate, but maybe as time goes on, that score will start to go down. And going down to number 2, we are at Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, 93% on Rotten Tomatoes. This was originally just called Star Wars. That's all it was, just Star Wars. 1977, you have one of the greatest Star Wars films of all time, New Hope. I think this is a tremendously well-made film. 93% is a damn near perfect score for it. Maybe bump it up to 9.5, 95%. I don't know. But I think this is a good score, accurate score. This is an A film. This is a great film. This is a film that even 42 years later, people still reference, people still know. It still influences a lot of us to this day. It has influenced so much of us to this day. And it's crazy to think that this one film, with all the production problems that it had, all the BS that it had to go through to come out with this story, it really does show that some things just simply are destiny. And, Star Wars is about that. The original trilogy is about that, and that's what this movie is about. It's crazy how this film can kind of summarize the original trilogy into one movie, but you can also expand upon it. And I think that's what these new Star Wars films have yet to capture, and that is this feeling of you have a destiny in your life. Luke Skywalker perfectly captured that character, and that innocence in us all of, wanting to go out there and go on this adventure and be in this world that you've never seen before, that you've never been to. And Luke did that. Luke did that in A New Hope. Luke went out on this adventure that we all loved and enjoyed. 1977, all these years later, it is still a fantastic film. I love how a story like this, Star Wars Episode 4, New Hope, is about accepting your destiny and going on your destiny, and yet this movie changed the lives of so many. It almost seemed like it was destiny that this film was to be made and to affect all of us. I mean, it's almost impossible that this film was made. I mean, it's crazy to think that you can make a film like this, and let's say you make a film nowadays and someone told you in 40 years they'd be coming out with the 9th episode of that film, and there were 2 spin-offs, and there's an entire franchise off that film, and you had no plans for that. You had no plans to keep it going that long. You really didn't think it would be going for 40 years. Just absolutely fucking stunning. So, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, 93%. The critics are absolutely right, and you can't give it a lower score than that. You can only give it a higher. And on to number 1, we have Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. It is at 95% on Rotten Tomatoes. And this film, I know there's some weird narrative going around nowadays from you young people who don't research Star Wars, that The Empire Strikes Back had a lot of negative reviews when it came out in 1980. No. You can go to the man, Gary Kurtz himself, the producer of this film and the original Star Wars, A New Hope. This film was well received upon release. And upon release, with the critics and the audiences, everyone enjoyed this film. There's always going to be naysayers, no matter what. You're not going to please everybody. But this film is perhaps the greatest sequel of all time. The story, the characters, the action, the pacing, everything about this film is amazing. The score, oh my gosh, the score. This film really enhanced the story of Star Wars, really enhanced what Episode 4, A New Hope, built and took it to a whole nother level. Luke Skywalker is now this kid going on his journey to become a Jedi. Darth Vader is not just some villain anymore. No, you learn more about him. He becomes a more intimidating figure. He is now a human. He's a man. You learn that about him. There's some human elements about him. You learn that in this film. And you learn about Yoda, that surprise that, even in small things, you can be powerful in the Force. You learn more about the Force. This movie asks a lot of questions. Luke is a great protagonist in this film because he asks so many questions that we, the audience, ourselves are asking. Is the dark side stronger? And, Yoda's like, no. That's a question that audiences wanted to know back then, and we still would want to know watching this film. I don't think you're going to make a better Star Wars film than this. This is the gold standard of Star Wars. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. You can't refute it. You can try to make up your own little theories and your own little speculations and give your opinion that everyone is entitled to hear, apparently. But there is no other great Star Wars film other than Empire Strikes Back. This is number 1. This is the best. And it's crazy that the collaboration on this film is what made it so great. You had all these creative minds coming together and collaborating to make such an outstanding movie that still to this day cannot be topped in Star Wars so far. And it really shows what Star Wars is about. It's not about the spaceships, the lightsabers, all that action stuff, and all the little corny little jokes that they have going on nowadays, and making it on what really is good and evil, and whose political ideology you should really side with. No. Irvin Kershner said it best. It's not a science fiction story. It's a fairy tale. It's about good versus evil. It's about the characters and the story and the adventure that you have along the way. And that is what Star Wars is about. Episode 5 is what Star Wars is about. And I am going to be that arrogant asshole and say, if you think anything is better than Empire Strikes Back, then you don't know Star Wars. But that's just my opinion, and apparently that is the opinion of the critics. Tell me your thoughts. What do you think about the Rotten Tomatoes score? So one last time, let's go through the Rotten Tomatoes list. At number 10, they have Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. It is at 54%. At number 9, they have Episode 2, Attack the Clones at 65%. At number 8, they have Solo, A Star Wars Story at 70%. At number 7, Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith at 80%. Number 6, Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, 81%. Number 5, Rogue One, A Star Wars Story at 84%. Number 4, Star Wars The Last Jedi, 91%. Number 3, Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens, 92%. Number 2, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, 93%. And number 1, Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, 95%. So tell me your thoughts about the list. What is your own list? Do you agree with the critics? Do you not? What are your thoughts about these films and their rankings? And what do you think about Rotten Tomatoes score and the future of Rotten Tomatoes and how we judge and criticize movies? But tell me your thoughts below. What do you guys think? Which is your favorite Star Wars movie? What is your top 10 list? Does it look like the one on Rotten Tomatoes or does it not? Tell me your thoughts below. I'm Star Wars Only. Hope you guys enjoy this video. I'll see y'all next time. May the Force be with you, always.